To someone who's never sat down and read the original A Study in Scarlet, they might be a bit confused at this title. To those who have read the original story, they're probably thinking, finally, please, yes, tell us more about early wacky Mormonism. Hi, I'm V. Not only am I ex-Mormon, but I have a major interest in Sherlock Holmes. Of course, my middle school and high school years were filled with the insanity that is Super Hulock, and yes, I had exposure to BBC's Sherlock at a very formative age. But I like to think of myself as a reformed Sherlock Holmes fan. A while back, I made it my goal to reread all 60 Sherlock Holmes stories, all 4 novels, and 56 short stories. Now, I have a couple different collections in my possession, however, I am very fond of this treasury of Sherlock Holmes that belonged to my mother, and before that, her mother. This was published in 1952 and has been passed down to me through my maternal family, so I find it very special, and I've had it for many, many years. The contents of this are 2 novels, A Study in Scarlet and The Hound of the Baskervilles, and 27 of the 56 short stories. Also has an introduction by Adrian Conan Doyle, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's son, so very good collection to have in my bookshelf. I will be using this edition, which I just checked, not 1952, 1955. Apologies. So for this video, I will be using specifically this edition, as well as citations from other books and resources that you will find either in the video description, in the text of this video, or on my blog. I will publish the entire script to this video, although it won't be a perfect one-for-one because I'm ad-libbing a little bit. So if you're keen to follow along, that's where we're going. Now, when I decided to do my big reread of all the Sherlock Holmes stories, I decided to go in chronological order rather than publication order. I kept putting off my endeavors of doing this reread until I found an antique copy of A Study in Scarlet for $5 at a secondhand bookstore. There's no publication date, but if my deductions are correct, it is published somewhere between 1896 and 1899. So yeah, it's a very, very early edition of A Study in Scarlet. I do not have it with me here in New Zealand, as I took it back to the US with the intention of fixing the spine. I did not do that, and I was very afraid of going through security and doing another international trip with it, given its fragile state. So it's at my parents' house. Finding an antique copy of a Sherlock Holmes book after really a decade of searching and crying over bidding wars on the internet that got a little too high for my budget as a teenager and early adult really was the kick in the pants I needed to really get started on this read. And so naturally, being chronological order, I got started with A Study in Scarlet, the book that I found. The last time that I read this introduction of Sherlock Holmes into the world was when I was 13 years old. So not only was I still a child, I was a Mormon child. Rereading it now made me realize exactly how much I had missed, whether that was due to my lack of comprehension or the religion I was a part of. Not sure, but we'll get to that. At 13, I did somehow believe that I had entirely understood a piece of Victorian literature that, upon rereading as an adult, criticizes the very religion that I was a part of. I've waffled on long enough. I'm sure a lot of you are confused as to why Mormonism has a connection to Sherlock Holmes. So let me give a little bit of background. The very first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, is the story of 2 murders that take place in London. However, both victims and the perpetrator aren't English at all. Not only are they American, but they're from Utah. There is an entire section of A Study in Scarlet that is dedicated to this backstory in Utah. The LDS Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is more well known as the Mormon Church, which is their nickname that they get from the Book of Mormon, which is part of their Holy Scripture alongside the Bible, and the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. We're going to focus on the Book of Mormon. They have been officially known as the Latter-day Saints since the church was founded, but they really leaned into the Mormon nickname, especially in the 2000s during the I'm a Mormon campaign. It was really only in very recent years that the Mormon Church started distancing themselves from the name Mormon. They've sort of rebranded themselves, or tried to, and try to go by their full legal name, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but that's a mouthful. And since I call myself ex-Mormon and people know them as Mormons, for the sake of simplicity and time, I will be saying Mormon in this video, and that is not to be insulting by any means or disrespectful. That is simply because when I was growing up, I was Mormon. And in this book, they are the Mormons. And the world knows them as Mormon. So to keep things easy to understand, I'll be using Mormon as the name. But with all that being said, I feel like that's relevant enough information for us to dive into a study in Scarlet and see how its portrayal of Mormonism really compares to real history as well as the modern Mormon faith. And let's see what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has to say about the Mormons. For us to fully be on the same page here when it comes to these outside perspectives of Mormonism, first, please allow me to give a very, very, very simple summary of Mormon history. To give you this summary, I'll be using the information I collected in my time as a Mormon, as well as Google, and Under the Banner of Heaven by John Krakauer. I've never said his name out loud. Apologies. As well as Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling by Richard Lyman Bushman. So if you would like to, again, look along with me and view my sources, these are the main two books. Otherwise, I'm using Google and the knowledge I have in my brain and my personal experiences and anecdotes. Shout out to my Kiwi ex-Mormon friend for giving me this book, and shout out to her parents for giving it to her. So, thank you. Very useful in my research. The founder of the LDS Church, Joseph Smith Jr., was born in 1805 in Sharon, Vermont. In 1820, Joseph Smith claimed to have been visited by God the Father and his son, Jesus Christ, in what is known to Mormons as the Sacred Grove. It is in Palmyra, New York, where I've been. In fall of 1827, he claimed to have been visited by an angel who told him where to find golden plates buried in the ground, and on those golden plates was a record of early indigenous Americans and their relationship with Jesus Christ. Although conveniently, like, no one else was really allowed to look at the plates. So, finally, in 1830, the Book of Mormon is published, and the church is officially founded, and it is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In 1833 is where we get the first instance of a very, very recognizable part of the Mormon Church, which is plural marriage, or polygamy. It was in this year that Joseph Smith married Fanny Alger, which was the first plural marriage in the church history, as she was his second wife, his first wife being Emma Smith. Now, the legitimacy of this marriage is definitely contested by both church historians and historians who are not Mormon. And this is really a hot topic of contention at the time and now. In fact, it's sometimes argued that Fanny Alger was not the first plural wife of Joseph Smith. Some people say that Louise Beeman was Joseph Smith's first plural wife. They married in 1841. Although, according to Rough Stone Rolling, there is evidence that Joseph was a polygamist by 1835. He was accused of having a dirty, nasty, filthy affair by none other than Oliver Cowdery. And Oliver Cowdery was a significant leader in the early Mormon church. Regardless of the legitimacy of the marriage or the exact timeline of who was the first plural wife and when did that happen or whatever, who was it really, we do know for certain, and we can say Joseph Smith was a polygamist. There's no beating around the bush there. Joseph Smith had more than one wife. Don't worry about the dates too much. It's not super important. I'm just trying to create a basic timeline for you guys. And over the next several years, there are a collection of protests, riot, crimes, murders, allegations, etc., controversies, and it all drives the Mormon faith across, up, and down, and all over New England and the Midwest. As far south as Missouri and as far west. The church goes as far south as Missouri and as far west as Ohio. Later Illinois, and then later Utah. We'll get there. Now, of course, Americans are becoming very aware of this new, unique, shall we say, religion that was developing in their country. But it wasn't until 1837 that the first missionaries went over to another country. It was June of that year that the Mormons decided we're going to spread our good word, and the first missionaries were sent to England. Well, Great Britain, I guess, as a whole. While they'd certainly made the news for their interesting beliefs, this was really the first time they were on an international stage. By 1844, Joseph Smith had got arrested again, and then on the 27th of June of that year, he was shot dead in Carthage, Illinois, after several men broke into the jail where he was being held. Okay, I promise there's not much more. I really hope I'm not overloading you with all of this information. Like I said, you don't need to remember the dates or anything exact, just a gist of things. Kid says he sees God, then he claims he finds scripture, and then he forms a church, and then the church is controversial, and they practice polygamy. He practices polygamy, really. It was just kind of him at first. And then the church started spreading internationally, and then he died. Okay, that's where we're at. That's all you really need to know. Okay, I lied. That's not all you need to know. That's all you need to... We're going to keep going. With Joseph Smith dead, there is a fissure in the church, but we're going to continue following what will be referred as the mainstream Mormon church. There were a couple of different fissures in church history, so there are a couple different versions of Mormonism. You have people who believe certain leaders are or aren't supposed to be leaders, or that certain doctrine should be interpreted a certain way. Like a lot of different religions, there are technically different sects of Mormonism, but the one that you think of when you hear Mormon, that's the mainstream Mormon church. That's what I was raised in, and that's what most people, it's the biggest one, because it's the main one. So we're going to keep following that timeline. If we follow the mainstream Mormon church, we get the new leader, Brigham Young. In 1847, Brigham Young begins leading the church out west to Utah, and Utah is not a part of the United States at this time. It's a territory. They pioneer across the plains, very manifest destiny. The Mormon exodus lasted until roughly 1868, and with Brigham Young as the new leader and a new home out in Utah, polygamy really began to spread within the religion. And here, with the move to Utah and Brigham Young as prophet, is when A Study in Scarlet takes place. Part 2 of A Study in Scarlet. Now, Brigham Young was, and is, notorious. Perhaps you've heard of BYU or seen the videos of young men and women saying they'd rather take a bullet than a sip of coffee. That's BYU. It's named after Brigham Young. It's Brigham Young University. It's the Mormon college. So he's a very large, important figure in church history, and with that comes lots of controversy to go around. I need you guys to understand that in his lifetime, Brigham Young took on 56 wives. 56. I want that to sink in for you for just a second. Now, Brigham Young did start taking on more wives before Joseph Smith's passing, but there's really a really noticeable difference after Joseph Smith's death, right after. Brigham Young ended up dying in 1877, about 10 years before A Study in Scarlet is first published, but he's a character. He is a character in A Study in Scarlet, so you will get to hear all about him if you read it. Even though Study in Scarlet was published in 1887, it takes place a little bit earlier. I believe it takes place in 1881, but again, part 2 is like a whole flashback, so Brigham Young's there. Congratulations, you are all caught up on early Mormon history from the First Division to Brigham Young and Utah. As an ex-Mormon, there's a lot of hurt that comes with the Mormon church, particularly for me, church history, as that is what broke my shelf. The phrase, "my shelf broke," is an expression used by ex-Mormons to describe the moment or like the one thing that made them realize the church isn't true. It's essentially saying the same thing as it's the straw that broke the camel's back. Now that I've been out of the church for a number of years, I actually find it really fascinating to look at church history from a new perspective, not in a religious way, but in a history way. Viewing it from a historical standpoint rather than a religious one has honestly made it super interesting. I'm not gonna lie. Like, yeah, Joseph Smith was a terrible person. But being able to see him as like just some weird guy instead of a religious figure is like kind of funny. Like, you've just got this kid wandering around claiming he's starting a religion because he saw God out in the woods, and then he found a book buried in the ground written by the indigenous American. Like, okay, kid, go run your dad's errands now. Sure, whatever. Anyway, A Study in Scarlet is split into 2 parts. Part 1 is called Being a Reprint from the Reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D., late of the Army Medical Department. Long. I know. Bring it up with Conan Doyle. Part 2 is called The Country of the Saints. Much more simple. While not all of Part 2 is dedicated to this backstory in Utah, 5 out of 7 of the chapters are, which makes it a very significant part of the story. I feel the best way to express my thoughts on how Mormonism is portrayed in this book is to go chapter by chapter and analyze it. So, let's begin. As far as part 1 goes, I don't really have much to say. No, that's not true. I actually do have a lot to say, but not a lot of it has to do with Mormonism. Actually, none of it has to do with Mormonism. I just have thoughts on Sherlock Holmes is all. Normally, I would say let's move on, but in case you have not read A Study in Scarlet, I shall provide to you a brief summary. Although I'm going to go ahead and assume here that everyone that's watching this has some base knowledge of Sherlock Holmes, because if you don't, how? If you somehow have no clue what's going on, I'm proud of you for expanding your horizons on clicking on random videos, I guess. In case you've never read the original books, a majority of them are written from Watson's point of view. It's first person from him. It's as if he is writing down the adventures. He is our narrator. I think there's only, if I remember correctly, 2 that are not Watson's point of view, so he's our guy. He is aware that he's telling a story and he's very intentional with it, and that's important to keep in mind when reading the books. Just as you'd expect, the very first Sherlock Holmes novel introduces our main characters, Dr. John Watson and Sherlock Holmes. And while it's published in 1887, it's pretty much agreed upon that it first takes place in 1881. Although that is a little bit debated, there's no direct confirmation that we can find. There are really interesting discussions to be had in Holmesian scholarship. It's a whole thing, and I find it endlessly fascinating, but that's not what we're here for. The novel begins with Watson arriving in London after serving in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which lasted from 1878 to 1880. Now that he's back in England, he's in need of a flatmate. He runs into an old friend, and that old friend introduces him to another man who is also looking for a flatmate. Enter Sherlock Holmes. And thus begins the snowball of one of the greatest, largest, most recognizable collections of English literature. After some time living together, that is where our mystery truly begins. A man has been found dead under mysterious circumstances, with a message written in blood on the wall. Rache. I don't speak German, forgive my pronunciation. In his investigation, Holmes finds one particular important clue, a woman's ring. They later find that a man who knew this victim was also found dead in his hotel room. Holmes quickly sets a trap for our perpetrator, and once they catch him, our backstory and motivation is revealed. As we begin part 2, we enter the backstory portion of the novel, and we meet John Ferrier and Lucy, 2 non-Mormons crossing the plains of America. Their entire company is dead, and they are on death's door as well. They accept their fate when a caravan of Mormons show up. John Ferrier is quick to adopt Lucy, as they are the only 2 survivors of their company. Something that immediately stands out to me is what one of these Mormon characters says when they bring up their faith. Now, it's not the first line to come out of their mouths, but it is the first mention of religion. When asked who they are and why there are so many of them, a young man replies, "We are the persecuted children of God." The very first instance Mormonism is introduced, it is portrayed as the members victimizing themselves. This is not John Ferrier, an outsider, saying, "Oh, you are persecuted." This is a member of the religion saying, "We are persecuted." Before even stating the name of their religion, they first say, "We are the persecuted children of God." They identify themselves as victims before Mormons. This is interesting to me because there are, of course, many things you can take away from this. One might say that Conan Doyle is painting the Mormons as self-victimizing, which would lead to an interesting sort of contradiction when you see later on all the crimes committed by the Mormons. Someone else might say, well, it's true. It is true. The Mormons were persecuted. It's not like he's wrong. And yes, it is true that Mormons were run out of several towns and even whole states, but that's because they were committing crimes. It was not necessarily because of their religious beliefs. They were criminals. But that is neither here or there when we come to this idea of we are the persecuted children of God. We just need to know that They think they're persecuted, and that's how they introduce themselves, not as Mormons, but as persecuted people. It really could be nothing more than Conan Doyle choosing to be flowery with his language. It's common knowledge by this point that the Mormons have been run out of America, hence why they are now in Utah. Perhaps it's nothing more than a simple introduction, but it's certainly an interesting choice for a non-Mormon man to write a Mormon character in this way. A minor thing that catches my attention is Conan Doyle's spelling of Moroni. At least I think that's what he's trying to say. He spells it Morona, M-E-R-O-N-A, and I can't tell if that's him writing an accent or being mistaken. He doesn't really write in accents very much, so I'm not entirely sure. When the description of this group clicks in John Ferrier's mind, he says, "I see, you are the Mormons," and they respond with, "We are the Mormons," in one voice, as it says here. This definitely feels a little bit creepy, a little bit culty. Throughout the book, it becomes clear that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is quite critical of the Mormon faith, so I would imagine that this is intentional. As John and Lucy join the Mormon pioneers and thank them for saving their lives, they are told that they cannot go with them and they cannot receive food and drink unless they join the Mormon church. They are told it is better far that your bones should bleach in this wilderness than that you should prove to be that little speck of decay which in time corrupts the whole fruit. Will you come with us on these terms? Those are pretty extreme conditions. Join the Mormon faith or die. I'm gonna get personal here for a second. I'm gonna share an example in my life as growing up Mormon that I feel like relates to this little bit in the book, specifically the idea that a little speck can corrupt the whole fruit. I want to preface this by saying that this is an extreme example. Okay, it is. I acknowledge that, and I want you to acknowledge that as well. But it still represents this attitude very well, I believe, and it can still be sometimes prevalent in the mainstream Mormon church, this idea that a little thing can destroy everything. When you are between the ages of 12 and 17, 18, you are either a young man or a young woman. And that's not just saying like, oh, you're a boy or a girl who is a young, adolescent. Like that's, you are either going to young women's or young men's in the afternoon on Sundays. It's like a category. It's like a Sunday school thing. The Sunday school classes are split up accordingly by gender, as well as most youth activities, not just Sunday school. When I was in Young Women's, there was a girl who is a few years older than me. I totally looked up to her because she was just so cool. She dyed her hair and she went to concerts and she made out with boys. She was, such a rebel. But she was also just really intelligent. I respected her a lot. She would repeatedly go to bat for the queer community at church, in church meetings, in Sunday school. She would call out homophobia and transphobia in Sunday school lessons, and she didn't care that it rubbed the leaders the wrong way. And I thought that was very brave of her. I was about 15 when, as a young women's group, we were driving to the nearest Mormon temple, and in the car, as it often does, the topic of marriage and children came up. And this girl said, I don't know if I want to get married. I definitely don't want kids. It was in that very instant, at 15 years old, that it occurred to me for the very first time in my life that I didn't have to get married or have kids. The world would not stop spinning and my life would not end if I didn't do those things. I remember sitting there in shock for quite a while because I genuinely had never even considered that before. The leaders in the car immediately went into damage control and were like, oh, you'll change your mind, or, well, you'll get married in the temple, right, or once you meet the right guy, things will change. We're still under the commandment to multiply and replenish the earth. The usual nonsense. But their words did not change the fact that one girl's small rebellion against the church and the expectations of the church changed my views. It changed my life. It changed how I viewed my life and the whole life that I had ahead of myself. Then one day, she disappeared. Nothing, without a trace. I didn't know what happened. Shortly after she vanished, the rest of her family did too. I had no idea where they're going. No one talked about it. Just radio silence. Nothing. Gone. She was gone. They were all gone. Now, I don't know the whole story, and I am not going to sit here and speculate. That would be inappropriate of me to do. I'm not going to sit here and think, what did she do? I, however, do know this. She was going around and saying things that were antithetical to Mormon doctrine. Don't want to get married. Don't want to have kids. I want to live how I want. I'm a woman and I'm going to go out and get so highly educated and be powerful and independent on my own. And the church doesn't like that, let's be honest. Another thing I know for certain, she was directly related to a general authority. To those unaware, a general authority is a very high figure in the Mormon church. There's the Mormon prophet, and then all of his underlings, or the Quorum of the 12, as they're called, and more generally, they are all general authorities. Under the Quorum of the 12, you have the Quorum of the 70, whom can be considered general or regional. I think it really depends on location, role, and circumstance. I can't say for certain. I had heard of this relative of hers long before I met her, because he was fairly high up in the church. I'd seen his face in conferences, and I had heard his name in talks before I ever knew who she was. He was a fairly powerful guy, is still in the church a fairly powerful guy. For years, I genuinely thought that she took her own life. The fact that she vanished and then everyone else did, it kind of made sense to me. It was an odd sort of grieving that I had to go through because, like, she wasn't my best friend by any means, but I looked up to her. I was friendly with her. I would say I'm friends with her, and she's just gone. She's just gone. I had no idea if she was alive or not, and for years I just assumed the worst. Years later, I've left the church myself at this point. I go and see friend recommendations on Facebook, and there's a profile picture that looks like her. I double checked, and of course my very first thought was, oh my god, thank god she's alive. But then my second thought was, is she pregnant? I friended her immediately, and as soon as she accepted my request, I went scrolling through her page, and it was made very clear to me right off the bat that she was married and had one child and another child on the way. Now, absolutely, people can change their minds about marriage and children. God knows I've gone back and forth on the idea, but something was not sitting right with me. Something was definitely wrong. As I scrolled further and further down on her page, I was greeted with extreme homophobia and transphobia, the likes of which I'd only ever really seen maybe a handful of times that were coming from accounts that weren't rage bait. It was so blatant and honestly violent to the point where I began to feel ill. How could this girl that I had known to run around and defend the queer community and express her distaste toward the institution of marriage and the idea of having children suddenly be posting such vile content in between photos of her wedding and sonograms? My brother was closer to her than I was. He was closer to her in age. He eventually, when I brought my concerns to him, revealed to me the truth. She had been sent away to a troubled teen camp. I won't go into the details of these organizations, as that is an entire video on its own, but I highly recommend that you look into the troubled teen industry and the disgusting acts of violence committed against children at these institutions. There are plenty of videos from researchers, journalists, and survivors themselves. While there isn't a direct and overt connection between the LDS Church and these institutions of these troubled teen camps, in their current iteration, there are certainly surface level ones. The most troubled teen camps are in Utah State. Most of them are founded by Mormons, and in fact the alleged creator of so-called wilderness camps, Larry Dean Olson, was Mormon. he attended BYU. Now, to his credit, Olson was not happy with the way that his work was turned into almost militaristic torture camps, stating, "They have failed to get the heart of what we're doing. Instead, they've gone to the boot camp idea and yelling in the face. For most kids, that doesn't work." The man who's been deemed responsible for turning these wilderness camps into the troubled teen camps that we know today and making it the lucrative industry it is in our age is Steve Cardizano, also a BYU alum. He not only increased the cost of these camps, but the intensity as well. His treatment of children was so vile, in fact, that he was banned from working with children in the state of Utah after a girl at one of his camps died. But he was allowed to continue work in other states. I am not going to get into testimonials or graphic details, but the abuse that these kids endure at these kind of camps is appalling, to say the least. Any and all forms of abuse that you can think of occur at these camps. On many, many, many occasions, these things have led to death. All of this to say that the need to keep things squeaky clean within the Mormon Church in even violent ways is still prevalent today. Even if it does not come directly from church leaders as a part of the church, it is very culturally Mormon. I don't know what this girl experienced. And I'm not going to message her after not speaking for years and try to drag that out of her. That would be horrible of me to do. But whatever abuse and frankly brainwashing she endured had to have been horrible. And while I am upset with the things she's posted publicly online, I am more so just happy that she is alive. She made it out. Alive. Unlike so many people. The fact that these Mormon characters in A Study in Scarlet are so quick to turn to death as an alternative to corrupting other members of the institution is not unusual by any means, especially for the era. And as we've discussed, we can still see it today, although not coming directly from the church and not as overt. It's definitely seen as more extremist. Your everyday average run-of-the-mill Mormon is not going to be boasting about teen troubled camps. That's just not happening. In this era, the concept of blood atonement is still taught, which is, oh boy, let's get into that. Joseph Smith believed that some sins were so unforgivable that the only way to atone was to spill his blood upon the ground and let the smoke thereof ascend up to God. But I'm getting ahead of myself. One final note on this chapter is the mention that Brigham Young spoke with the voice of Joseph Smith, which I'm not going to say really happened because it's a religious piece of lore, I guess. But I was taught this growing up. I was taught that this was a thing that really happened. I was taught that this happened, and it was how the members knew that Brigham Young was to be the next prophet after Joseph Smith. After Joseph Smith died, it said that Brigham Young spoke and addressed the members of the church, and when he spoke, he had the voice of Joseph Smith, and that's how they knew that he was called of God. It's in this chapter that we skip forward a number of years and find that John Ferrier has not married. The Mormons are perplexed by this decision to remain unwed, and some members actually resent him for it, believing that he may not have fully embraced the religion. Outside of the polygamous practices of the time, marriage was still very, very important, and is today in the Mormon faith. Marriage and children is one of the most base parts of the faith, and to not have those things makes you not the best Mormon you could be. In the Mormon faith, there are 3 tiers of heaven: the telestial, terrestrial, and celestial. Yeah, we're getting into that. It would take me ages to explain the plan of salvation, so I'm just going to tell you this. They are all heaven, they are all good, but there is, of course, good, better, best. In order to get into the celestial kingdom, you must participate in and complete each and every major step, I guess, of Mormonism. Baptism, the laying on of hands, or being blessed with the Holy Spirit, and endowment. Now, these are the only requirements to get into the celestial kingdom as stated officially, but I distinctly remember being taught that one had to be married as well. Now, this can take place in the afterlife. If you die single, you're not doomed to hell. It could very well be that I am confusing the need for marriage as an indicator of the level of heaven with levels of exaltation, which to this day, I still don't understand. And while it may technically not be a requirement to be married in the Mormon church, there's certainly an attitude of you're not a good Mormon if you're not married and you don't have kids. The Mormon church is structured into wards, which is what we call our congregations. There are different kinds of wards. The big one that most people will end up seeing is the family ward, which is exactly how it sounds. It's just the everyday families, just everyone. It's what you imagine when your mind comes up with a Mormon church service. Then there's the YSA ward, aka the Young Single Adult ward, and let's be honest, the whole purpose is to get these kids married off to each other. It's all the college students. Anyone 18 to 30 can attend YSA if they are single once you are married, or if you age out and you're no longer a young single person, then you are kicked out. I started attending YSA when I was 18. Though I had already been having an ongoing faith crisis for a year at that point, so my experience was definitely interesting. There was one distinct moment that I remember, which was being asked out by a guy that I had not even spoken a single word to, and I panicked and said yes because I had no idea what to do and I felt like I was trapped in a corner. I had literal night terrors, not nightmares, night terrors for multiple days, and then eventually gathered the courage to tell him, oh, I'm too busy. Oh, I just started college and I just started a new job, and I conveniently left out all the times that I had woken up sweating and crying in the middle of the night, over just the thought of going on a date with him. Surprise, surprise, I came out as a lesbian a year later. Who saw that coming? Interestingly, not long after this incident, we had the bishop, who's like the ward leader. My dad was bishop at one point. That's fun. He entered our Relief Society meeting, which is Sunday school for adult women. And he told us that we had to stop telling the boys no when they asked us on dates. He told us that. And while this is the attitude in the modern day church, I can only imagine how suspicious members must have been when a worthy man decided not to marry during the era of polygamy. Such is the case with Farrier. Here in this chapter is where we are introduced to another major character, Jefferson Hope. Now, this really isn't a Mormon note, but I will say that for a majority of my reread, I actually read Jefferson Hope as an indigenous man, Washoe to be specific. The way he's described as having an extreme understanding of the landscape and his skill with navigating the area and understanding its resources immediately read to me as, oh, so he's indigenous. I feel like an adaptation, like a film or television adaptation, that casts Jefferson Hope as an indigenous man would be fascinating, especially given the relationship between Mormons and indigenous Americans. I'm going to be harsh for a second, but I need to say it, and I just need to get it out of the way. The Mormon church is extremely racist. I feel like that goes without saying, but non-Mormons don't really tend to understand how deep racism against Native Americans goes in the Mormon faith. The Book of Mormon, Latter-day Saint doctrine itself, the very foundation of the religion, shows an imagined history of the Americas that paints the indigenous people as, okay, this is really weird to say out loud, but I'm just going to say it, Jews who sailed across the Atlantic to the New World and populated the continent. Oh, but the good ones were killed by the bad ones, and now only the bad ones remain, aka the Native Americans. So I feel like if an adaptation took the route of making Jefferson Hope an indigenous man, would not only exemplify the source material, but there's so much commentary that could be added just doing that alone, just given the relationship between Mormons and indigenous Americans. But regardless of how I feel he should be presented, Hope is a non-Mormon. That is certain. AKA a Gentile, which, yes, that was stolen from Judaism. A lot of Mormonism was. But when he saves Lucy's life, she couldn't care less. It's love at first sight. They're determined to run away together after his next excursion, and all will be well. Right? Immediately, we are given John Ferrier's thoughts on Lucy marrying Jefferson Hope. John Ferrier's heart was sore within him when he thought of the young man's return and the impending loss of his adopted child. Yet her bright and happy face reconciled him to the arrangement more than any argument could have done. He had always determined, deep down in his resolute heart, that nothing would ever induce him to allow his daughter to wed a Mormon. Such a marriage he regarded as no marriage at all, but as a shame and a disgrace. Even though he has accepted the faith in every other regard and is considered a man of good standing within the church, John Ferrier makes it very clear that he thinks not so highly of the practice of polygamy. Since polygamy is widely practiced at this time, this is obviously in protection of her. And even though he has these thoughts, he keeps them to himself because to express an unorthodox opinion was a dangerous matter in those days in the land of the saints. This is where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle really starts to paint a picture of the seedy underbelly of the Mormon religion and Utah as a whole. The unseen threats that make people disappear. He even says, "Not the Inquisition of Seville, nor the German Wehrmacht," again, I don't speak German, please forgive my pronunciation, "nor the secret societies of Italy were ever able to put a more formidable machinery into motion." That's an extreme claim. What makes him say this? He goes on to claim that anyone who speaks out against the church is immediately vanished. As far as the novel states, this power was used exclusively as a way to keep people from leaving the church, but then it grew into something bigger. Then we're given names: the Danite Band and the Avenging Angels. The legitimacy of these groups is highly scrutinized, and due to the secretive nature, their purpose is debated. According to Rough Stone Rolling, the name Danites derives from Daughters of Zion, although others say that it derives from what is called the tribe of Dan, which is a tribe of Israel. Although we can say that it was first established in 1838. While Joseph Smith did not found the Danites, he was held accountable for their actions in a court of law, their crimes being pretty much as Conan Doyle described. They primarily went after dissenters. However, they did play a role in the Missouri-Mormon War. Yes, the Missouri-Mormon War. You haven't heard? There is a lot of history there, but I don't think it's entirely relevant for the discussion we are having, so research to your heart's content, but I'm going to skip ahead. Fun fact, there is no hell, per se, in the Mormon faith, but rather outer darkness. And the only way to get there is to know the spirit and then deny it. AKA leave the church. Thankfully, people who leave the church aren't hunted down by the Mormon Mafia anymore, but there's definitely still the doctrinal attitude of doom and destruction for those that leave. Not to mention, they're still followed if their records aren't removed. I moved across the globe and had Mormon missionaries showing up at my door. I haven't stepped foot into a church building in 5 years. As for the name Avenging Angels, there's no evidence they existed. This truly does seem to be just made up by Conan Doyle, which is odd because the Danites is right there. They're real. They're known. That's an actual organization. I don't know. Why make something up? Because it sounds cool? I mean, the Avenging Angels weren't real, but the Danites were. Past tense. Even in Conan Doyle's era, the Danites were gone. As Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would have been writing a study in Scarlet, the Danites had already been disbanded. They were dissolved in 1838 after the Mormon-Missouri War. So they only lasted for about a year. They were destroyed the very year they were created. That is when the actual leader was arrested, not Joseph Smith. There were, of course, rumors that the Danites were still active, and no doubt Conan Doyle would have heard that there was a possibility and they were a real threat, because they were a threat. Obviously, they started a war. And even though most agree that the Danites were no more after 1838, some of the violent rhetoric that was spoken by Brigham Young throughout his time as prophet made some members think that maybe there's still something going on there. Non-members and members alike thought maybe there was still some kind of force working for him. Of course, none of this can be proven, and it's generally regarded to be false. But regardless of the reality of the position of the Danites at the time, the book commits to using them. John Ferrier is then visited by none other than Brigham Young himself. Young confronts Farrier, asking him about his wives, and Farrier says that women were few, and there were many who had better claims than I. This right here is something that always stuck with me, and was one of the things that broke my shelf. As a teenager, I found myself asking, if there's a rough 50-50 split in gender and the population, how did polygamy work? I distinctly remember being taught that there were more women than there were men, and that is why polygamy happened. Let's fact check that. According to the 1860 census, the territory of Utah had 20,178 white male residents and 19,947 white female residents who were born in America or its territories. At the time, and still today, the Mormon Church was made up of primarily white people, so that is the number most relevant to the Mormon religion, even if not all of Utah's residents were Mormon. So the idea that there were just more women than there were men is provably false. One thing I heard a lot alongside this myth was the justification behind it. It's because so many men had died along the way to Utah, and these women needed new husbands to take care of them and look after their children, and this makes little sense considering women certainly also died on the trek. I don't think dysentery is a gendered issue. Speaking of trek, have you ever heard of trek with a capital T? Not Star Trek, Mormon Trek. Trek is an event where Mormon teens participate in what I would call LARPing of early Mormon pioneers. I participated at the age of 15, and I wasn't a fan of pushing a handcart for 3 days in a bonnet and a skirt. Brigham Young goes on to explain why he's visiting, and it's because of Lucy, who is now 17 and eligible for marriage. He mentions rumors floating around that she's been promised to a Gentile, which we know is Jefferson Hope. He reminds John Farrier that Joseph Smith was clear that members should only marry other members. He even offers what is portrayed as a direct quote from Joseph Smith, saying, "Let every maiden of the true faith marry one of the elect, for if she wed a Gentile, she commits a grievous sin." This is made up by Conan Doyle. There's no evidence that Smith said this. In fact, in the modern era of Mormonism, there is what is called flirt to convert, which is non-doctrinal, but still very funny. It's exactly what it sounds like. Girls, make sure to leverage those crushes boys have on you to get them to come to church with you. And it's also the general idea that if you date someone, you should make them come to church with you. Which, if they don't, then they're not the one. Encourages people to date within the religion or find people to bring in to the religion. While the importance of marriage in the Mormon faith cannot be understated, a temple sealing, which is an official Mormon marriage, can only be done between two Mormons. A temple sealing cannot be done between a member and a non-member, and that's not to say that interfaith marriages don't exist. I know of quite a few personally in my own life. They happen. I'm going to speak from a strictly personal and anecdotal point of view. When I say that I believe there is certainly a superiority that members who married other members have over interfaith marriages. And completely also anecdotally, it seems that flirt to convert tends to go the other way around. When I see non-members convert for their member partners, it's only on a superficial level, and it's really just to do a temple sealing because their Mormon partner wants it. It's not because they actually believe. I want to reiterate, that's all anecdotal. I have no statistics to back this up. I'm just saying, from what I've observed, I think that tends to be the case more often. Sometimes interfaith marriages work, sometimes they don't. On a doctrinal level, these marriages are seen as lesser and won't be recognized in heaven as only members, again, can be sealed to each other. And after all, a sealing is what ensures that you will actually still be married after you die. It's not till death do us part. It's for time and all eternity. That being said, it is not by any means against church policy to marry outside of the religion. Young goes on to say that the Sacred Council of Four has determined that Lucy needs to be married off. What the Sacred Council of Four is? anyone's guess. There has never been such a thing, and it's really unclear where Conan Doyle got this idea, or if it just sprang into his head one day and he put it in there. If it does have a legitimate origin, I imagine that it could possibly be the first presidency, which consists of the prophet and his first and second counselors. But that's 3 people. I don't know where Sacred Council of 4 came from. I don't know what it's supposed to represent if it does have real life inspirations. Young gives Farrier 2 options for Lucy for marriage: Strangerson or Drebber. And then he gives Farrier 1 month to decide. He makes a threat against him as he leaves, once again drawing the imagery of bleached bones in a desert. Lucy reveals that she overheard the entire conversation, and she is entirely distraught, understandably. They quickly determine that the best way out is to contact Hope and flee Utah entirely. I have a microphone now, and absolutely nothing else has changed. So that's how long I've been working on this video. Chapter 4 of Part 2 opens with Strangerson and Drebber at the Farrier home, fighting over who gets to take Lucy on as a wife. Farrier kicks them both out, and naturally, they threaten him as they leave. Farrier tells Lucy, "I would sooner see you in your grave, my girl, than the wife of either of them." Lucy wholeheartedly agrees. This action to prevent Lucy's marriage is definitely one of the more grievous things to take place in Salt Lake City, which means this so-called Council of 4 and the Danites are now surely after them because of their disobedience. Over the next several days, they get various threats, and a countdown appears that slowly dwindles away the month that they were promised. On the second to last day, Jefferson Hope returns, and the 3 of them gather together money and weapons and start their journey out of Salt Lake City. They're briefly almost caught by some Danites who are speaking in some kind of code, but that gives them an opportunity to slip by, really. This feels to me like another instance of entirely fictionalized secrecy to add to the drama of a murder mystery. They find another line of defense there to prevent them from leaving, although not exclusively them, but anyone, really, from leaving Salt Lake City. Hope tells them that they have permission to travel from the Holy 4 and recounts the code that they heard earlier, which gives them an out. And with that, freedom lay before them. While it is absolutely true that Mormons of the time were not very fond of non-Mormons coming in and out of the place that they had established as their home, they weren't usually violent. There are, of course, exceptions to this, and one of the big exceptions is the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which took place in September of 1857. Tensions were already high as the American government increased their presence in the territory of Utah, but that mixed with rumors that the Baker Fancher Party was having negative feelings about the Mormons, it led to a pretty terrible event. There are actual historians out there who can describe the event better than I can, and there are plenty of videos and articles about it, but I will give a brief synopsis. This is going to get a bit technical, so I will be actively reading my script off screen. Apologize for the lack of eye contact. The Baker Fancher Party, pioneers from Arkansas, were passing through Mountain Meadow, which is now often referred to as Mountain Meadows, and hence the Mountain Meadows Massacre. In the early morning, the party was fired upon, and the initial assumption was that they were being attacked by the Paiutes, an indigenous tribe in the area. And while it did later turn out to be true, it wasn't entirely true. It wasn't just the Paiutes. Also Mormons, dressed as Paiutes. The man leading the assault was a devout Mormon by the name of John D. Lee. There is an entire history of manipulation and coercion of Indigenous Americans by the Mormons due to the role of Indigenous Americans in their faith, in the Book of Mormon. According to George A. Smith, first cousin of the founder Joseph Smith Jr. and an apostle at this time, not long before the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Lee himself said, quote, that the Americans had a large army just east of the mountains and intended to kill all of the Mormons and Indians in Utah Territory, that the Indians must get ready and keep ready
for war against all of the Americans and obey what the Mormons told them to do, that this was the will of the Great Spirit. The Mountain Meadows Massacre was not a quick deal. It was a multi-day siege. Throughout the siege, a number of men from the Baker Fancher party spotted fair-skinned men among their attackers, which made them realize that they were being besieged by Mormons as well, not just the Paiutes. But by the night of September 10th, most of the Paiutes had ridden away from the mountain meadow in disgust, leaving the Saints with perhaps as few as 40 Indian mercenaries. Fearing that they no longer had sufficient manpower to overwhelm the immigrants' position by force, the Saints decided to end the standoff by means of subterfuge. Now, without nearly enough men to follow through with eliminating these pioneers, the Mormons approached and claimed that they were there to help them and protect them from their Paiute attackers. They began to be escorted away. Women, children, and injured separated from the uninjured, able-bodied, and walking wounded men. Each man of this party was guarded by an individual Mormon, and once given a command, each Mormon guard executed the pioneer that they walked beside. As the men were executed, the women and children were attacked, quote, by the Indians, among whom were Mormons in disguise, end quote. Nephi Johnson, a member of the Mormon party that helped carry out this attack, later stated that, quote, white men did most of the killing. In the end, only 17 people lived, leaving about 120 people dead. The only survivors were in fact children who were deemed too young to remember the event, thus not a threat. That is the only reason those 17 people were not murdered. However, their memory served them, and as a number of these children got older, they did recall these events. The children left alive were taken to Mormon homes to be raised as Latter-day Saints. Some were placed in the households of the very men who had murdered their parents and siblings. Thankfully, in later years, they were discovered and recovered by the federal government and placed with living family members. While this certainly was not the fate of every traveler that was not Mormon and passed through Utah, it certainly shows Mormon territorialism of the era at its absolute worst. And while a study in Scarlet perhaps exaggerates how closely Mormons kept track of who entered and left Salt Lake City and Utah as a whole, Conan Doyle likely knew that there was an element of truth to that and included it in his story. I'm really glad I invested in a microphone because it is terrible weather outside and the wind and rain is very loud. Summer? More like bummer. Jefferson Hope and John and Lucy Ferrier make their way further and further from Salt Lake City, Utah, with Carson City, Nevada being their end goal. As their provisions begin to run low, Hope gets anxious and decides to go look for some food. As an experienced hunter who has knowledge of the landscape, he doesn't think it'll take very long. That doesn't seem to be the case. It takes a significant amount of time for him to find an animal, kill the animal, find a way to carry it, and then drag it back to where they were staying. However, he finds that he has wandered off the beaten path and is completely lost. He finally finds his way back to their camp, only to see a smoldering fire and no sign of the Ferriers. He discovers footprints and hoofprints that leads him to a newly dug grave and a sign that reads, John Ferrier, formerly of Salt Lake City, died August 4th, 1860. With a second grave nowhere to be found, it becomes evident that Lucy has been taken back to Salt Lake City to be forced into a polygamous marriage, meaning that Jefferson Hope has failed. He does eventually, slowly, make his way back to Salt Lake City and discovers that there is a warrant out for his capture because he helped the Ferriers escape. He gets this information from a Mormon that he has worked with in the past, and he gets more information out of this man who says, "Be quick. The very rocks have ears and the trees eyes." Hope is informed that Lucy was forced to marry Drebber, and that Strangerson was the one to shoot John Ferrier. Less than a month later, Lucy dies. It's not made entirely clear how, but it's insinuated that it was due to just absolute heartbreak and distress. Before her burial, Hope sneaks in to see her, removes the wedding ring from her hand, saying that he refuses to let her be buried in such a thing, and vows revenge. That is the very ring discovered by Holmes at the crime scene that leads to the crack in the case. Hope then spends 21 years stalking Strangerson and Drebber. The two men end up leaving the Mormon church after a schism, which, as I said earlier, was very common in the early church. Hope follows Strangerson and Drebber from Utah to Ohio and then eventually Europe, St. Petersburg, Paris, Copenhagen, and then London. And there is where Hope finally catches up to them. A Study in Scarlet ends as most Sherlock Holmes stories do. Things are found out, the perpetrator is caught, a big explanation is given, and everything ends in a nice, neatly tied little bow. Now, at Baker Street, after being found out, Jefferson Hope informs everyone that he has an aortic aneurysm and has no idea how much longer he's going to live. He's proud of what he's done and has no issue confessing to the murders. He justifies his actions in the name of love for Lucy, and since he's to be dead soon anyway, he doesn't mind that he got caught. And although he does remark, "I've done my work now, and I don't care how soon I go, but I should like to leave some account of the business behind me. I don't want to be remembered as a common cutthroat." Hope explains that there was really no point in trying to get Strangerson or Drebber convicted in a court of law. It had been far too long since Ferrier's murder for that. But as far as he saw it, they were both responsible for the death of both John and Lucy Ferrier, meaning their deaths were deserved. Getting a job as a cab driver in London was not only a way to rebuild the savings that he had lost in tracking these two men down, but also gave him a way to continue his search for both Strangerson and Drebber. He made sure that Drebber saw the wedding ring as a reminder of what he'd done and the reason he faced such a fate. After he murders Drebber, Strangerson is easy enough to track down to his hotel, and he murders him there. Within a few short days, before Hope can face the magistrates, he's dead, and his work is finally done. Holmes takes the rest of the final chapter to explain his methods to Watson, and Watson, so highly impressed, insists that Holmes publishes his work, and if Holmes won't do it, he'll do it for him. And that, folks, is how Mormon polygamy kind of led to Sherlock Holmes. It's hardly a leap to say that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle did not give Mormons a glowing endorsement in A Study in Scarlet. The religion is portrayed as secretive and violent, which is not an unusual interpretation of the Mormons at this time because they were a very new, very strange church with a legitimately violent history. And while it is important to recognize and continue to criticize the violent actions and violent rhetoric that the Mormon church has perpetuated and continues to do, it's also very telling that every individual Mormon in A Study in Scarlet is a part of those thoughts and actions. Like any belief, you have some people who are more radical than others. But honestly, some people are just normal and trying to go about their lives, and they just so happen to be born into a certain religion. There's absolutely, don't get me wrong, there's absolutely something to be said about complacency and turning a blind eye. But every devout Mormon in A Study in Scarlet goes out of their way to be violent and hateful towards any non Mormon. It does seem, however, that Conan Doyle changed his opinion on the Mormons. In 1923, he was invited to Salt Lake City, Utah to give a talk about his spiritual beliefs. For those who don't know about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's personal and spiritual beliefs, I won't get into it here. That is a rabbit hole, and it's endlessly fascinating to me. I might do a video on that. BYU professor Levi Young had the opportunity to speak to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and he claimed that Conan Doyle apologized, and he said that, quote, he said that he had been misled by writings of the time about the church. His appearance in Utah did not go uncriticized. A number of members were very adamant that what he was doing was wrong, trying to earn money off of spirituality from people of a certain spiritual belief that he criticized, really. While a number of individuals were certainly opposed to his arrival in Utah, no Mormon church officials spoke out against him being at the tabernacle or giving a speech about spirituality there. And while Levi Young did claim that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle apologized, there's no written account or even verbal account directly from Conan Doyle himself that's traceable. So we just have to take Young at his words for it. Even though he didn't speak publicly on any change of opinion on the Mormons, he did speak on their hospitality, saying that he was, quote, profoundly grateful for the tolerance and cordiality with which he had received. Frankly, he did not expect to be allowed to speak in the Mormon tabernacle. Fair. When pressed about his portrayal of the Mormons in his writings of Sherlock Holmes, and particularly the Danites, he said it was, quote, best to let the matter rest, unquote. While we can't say for certain that Conan Doyle's views on the Mormon Church changed, as we have no direct quotes from him, it isn't a stretch to say that his portrayal of Mormonism would have impacted how society viewed the church at large. The far reaching nature of his works means that maybe someone's first introduction to Mormonism was reading A Study in Scarlet, which isn't exactly a fair first impression, to be honest. Though, if we really think about it, I mean, I would say that a lot of people in the modern age are introduced to Mormonism in the exact same way. Whether it's through The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, or Under the Banner of Heaven, or the Book of Mormon musical, most non Mormons are introduced to Mormonism through pop culture created by non Mormons and ex Mormons who tend to be critical of the church. Just look at South Park. It's hard to say Conan Doyle's true feelings on the church because even what he did say publicly, it could have been authentic or it could have just been saving face. Overall, no, his portrayal is not a positive one, but clearly he wasn't scared off because he did accept an invite to speak at a key Mormon location in Utah. I find it interesting that most adaptations of Sherlock Holmes entirely forego the religious motivations of A Study in Scarlet, though I can see how a modern production might be hesitant to include such a controversial topic as polygamy, or they might find it difficult to tie the backstory back into the mystery, because let's be honest, most people who read or watch Sherlock Holmes stories are in it for Holmes and Watson, not Mormonism. I find it really interesting that so many people nowadays are completely unaware of how big of a role Mormonism plays in A Study in Scarlet, which means, I guess, Sherlock Holmes at large. The entire first novel hinges on the beliefs of Mormonism, so I guess good things can come out of it. Does that mean we have Mormons to thank for giving us Sherlock Holmes? Is that what that means? I do hope that my insight as an ex-Mormon and a Sherlock Holmes fan has proved to be useful for people who are either interested in Sherlock Holmes or Mormonism or the intersection of the two. I appreciate your time and attention and hope this inspires you to look into any of these topics further. If you want to hear more about a specific thing I mentioned in this video, use the comments to let me know. I'm more than happy to keep making videos about Sherlock Holmes and or Mormonism. Trust me, I have a lot to say on both topics. But that being said, I look forward to sharing my knowledge with you again. Thanks for watching.